Hello, this is Andrew Al from Digital Charlotte, and welcome to the Digital Inclusion Exchange podcast. Today we'll be listening to the National Digital Inclusion Alliance's, also known as the NDIA's, Net Inclusion webinar series. The National Digital Inclusion Alliance Net Inclusion Conference has been a staple in the digital inclusion community for years, bringing hundreds of practitioners, advocates, academics, internet service providers, and policymakers together to share their knowledge. With social distancing in place, the NDIA is hosting the Net Inclusion 2020 webinar series to replace the conference. This series includes 8 one-hour webinars recorded live from September 16th through November 4th. You can find the full schedule, recordings, and resources at digitalinclusion.org/netinclusion2020 webinar series. The link to this will be in the description. Today's webinar topic is Digital Inclusion 101, the what, the why, and how to advocate, first recorded on September 16th, 2020. Enjoy.
There's a variety of guidebooks and items on our website. In the policy realm, we use what we learn from our affiliates to influence public policy. So when we first started NDIA, we created definitions for digital inclusion and digital equity. That was influencing public policy. You wouldn't think it, right? It's just a definition, but it really, now folks use those definitions. And so we changed the conversation. Awareness, we talk to the media a lot. We help you all with the terminology, right? That's all building awareness. Data and research, we don't conduct our own data gathering, but rather we use publicly available data and analyze it and share that out on the website. Here's those definitions for digital equity and digital inclusion. And I'm going to turn this over to Paolo.
Okay. Hey everyone, good afternoon, good morning. My name's Paolo Balboa, program manager here at NDIA. I come to this work having worked in technology training departments in public libraries, first in Cleveland and most recently at the NYPL. So given my background as a trainer and also in conjunction with the start of school again, I have some definitions to share with you. This will be a pop quiz. It will happen at the end of this webinar. So please take out your notebooks. Just kidding. Okay. Right, as Angela explained before, these definitions that we use to frame our work in the realm of digital inclusion, digital equity, and digital inclusion were created in conjunction with a network of affiliates who have been doing this work for several years, sometimes multiple decades in some cases. You're going to hear this word a lot over the course of this webinar. We conducted a working group to bring together, the best, brightest minds and ask them, in this case, how would you define this work? Right. A lot of what NDIA does is work to formalize and standardize the digital inclusion realm, and it helps to have relevant starting points, not only for people who have been working in this field for several years, but also for people who are new to this field. So, for instance, what do we mean when we talk about digital equity, and what do we mean when we talk about digital inclusion? Digital equity is the goal, right? Digital equity is where we want parity across society. So another way of saying this is that digital equity is a condition in which individuals and the communities that they live in have the capacity for full participation in society, democracy, and the economy. What does this mean in a practical sense? Well, 2020 is a big year for civic engagement. The census has been going on since April. It wraps up in 15 days, at least here in New York State. And also, of course, we have a general election coming in November. What COVID-19 has exposed is that everyone needs the internet, especially if you want to participate in society, in civics, and in a democracy. There's more folks filling out the census online simply because they have to, social distancing. We'll see in November what the rate of mail-in ballots and how to get to those mail-in ballots, what that looks like. The internet is essential now more than ever. So our work takes on that much more purpose. How do we get to this digital equity? How do we get to this parity? That's where this other definition, digital inclusion, comes into play. We're referring to as we see here, the activities necessary for full participation in society. So we break that up into 5 different bullets here. That looks like affordable home broadband, appropriate and affordable devices, digital literacy training, tech support, and applications. I will say that this third and fourth bullet point for digital literacy and tech support have taken on new purpose, again, in response to COVID-19. So we're thinking about getting devices to homes, making sure that our learners are well connected. But what happens if our learners don't know how to turn on that device? This idea of tech support, which may take the form of like a one-on-one hotline, an open email, is now a huge part of our work in the digital inclusion realm. So how do we get there, right? So we're further breaking down those bullet points into these three components: affordable home broadband, affordable devices, digital literacy trainings. What we hear, the phrase that we hear a lot in this world, and the phrase that you will probably hear a lot over the next coming months, years, is this idea of a three-legged stool. Our work as digital inclusion practitioners and advocates relies on a sort of a confluence of these three components working together to make it so that our communities are better connected and so that our learners are more informed. So this first leg of the stool, affordable broadband, how do we get there? I'm gonna bring it back a few slides here. Speaking of definitions, this idea of availability and adoption. If you're coming into this world for the first time, you may hear the word access thrown around a lot, especially in regards to broadband, right? A phrase can be like, make sure that they have good broadband access. We at NDIA and our network of affiliates actually encourage avoiding using the word access because it could mean either availability or adoption. In other words, it's not descriptive enough. So what do we actually mean? Let's break down that word access into its two components, availability and adoption. On one hand, availability refers to the physical infrastructure required to make home connectivity happen. That's useful, but that's just talking about some structures in the ground or built out. What we find at NDIA to be more useful is this other word, adoption. It's a more meaningful measurement because it's people focused. Adoption is referring to the idea of how many people are taking advantage of the available broadband infrastructure in their community. One of our community members, Colin Rhinesmith, who works for the Benton Foundation, published a paper a few years ago called Digital Inclusion and Meaningful Broadband Initiatives. Inside of that report, which I highly recommend you read, I would say when you go home, but you're probably already home. In that report, he plans out such a succinct and accurate definition of broadband adoption. It goes like this. Broadband adoption has traditionally been defined as residential subscribership to high-speed internet access. But for those in the field working to increase the digital capacity of communities, broadband adoption is daily access to the internet at speeds, quality, and capacity necessary to accomplish common tasks with the digital skills necessary to participate online and on a personal device and secure, convenient network. Now, to really underline the last three parts of that quote, Colin is talking about speeds, quality, as well as digital skills, as well as devices. If you've been paying attention, then that should sound like the three legs of the stool. So another way of saying this is that we're always talking about this confluence of connectivity, devices to connect, but then the elusive third part, the skills necessary to participate. So another way of looking at this, who isn't connected in the US? Between the urban and rural divide, which is extremely real, there are 18 million households that do not have broadband of any kind. Our work at NDIA emphasizes both the urban and the rural and the suburban in between. And this, you can see here that in urban areas, 14 million households are without broadband of any kind, whereas in rural areas, that's 4 million households. Another way of demonstrating this, or another way of saying this, is that that's as many households as California and New York combined, two of our biggest states. This data comes to us from the American Community Survey 5-year. So given these definitions that I've laid out for you, given some framework to work in, we can start talking about starting a digital inclusion program. A guide that NDIA has, I'm proud to say, just finished the revision of, as of this week, is something called the Digital Inclusion Startup Manual. The first iteration of the Digital Inclusion Startup Manual came out last April. In that startup manual, we convened a bunch of working groups and asked them, a bunch of working groups of people who are doing digital inclusion programs, and asked them, how did you get started? How did you get off the ground? And what recommendations would you like to provide for people who are new to this space or who are coming across these terms for the first time? In response to COVID-19, we made a big overhaul of select chapters of this startup manual. The two components of digital inclusion that were impacted the most in an age of COVID-19 were digital literacy trainings, as well as engaging newly interested funders and creating coalitions and partnerships. In fact, this Digital Inclusion Startup Manual, the revision, was born out of one of these coalitions. We partnered with a coalition in Chicago called Chicago Connected, who helped us frame and produce this new revision, which we're very happy to share as of this week. Our work in NDIA convened a working group of experts, asking them newly relevant questions in regards to COVID-19, and excerpts from those conversations, best practices, as well as several resources, several examples can be found on the Digital Inclusion Startup Manual. But in a practical sense, starting from the beginning, if your organization, or if you're trying to get buy-in within your organization for starting a digital inclusion program, it's going to be useful to do sort of like a needs assessment of your community. This screenshot that I'm sharing with you right now is an overhead view of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, using a tool called the i3 Connectivity Explorer. The i3 Connectivity Explorer, short for Internet as Infrastructure, was created by one of our community members named Bob Balance. It's really just a website, which can be dropped in the chat now. It's a website that pulls together data from different sources, primarily the FCC 477 broadband availability form, as well as American Community Survey 5-year estimates. By pulling together these different data sources, this website allows users like us to access it for free, but also plug in your locality and get an idea of what the digital divide looks like in your area. You know, when you're thinking about getting your program off the ground, or when you're thinking about trying to get buy-in from your organization or from funders, a visual tool helps a lot. Personally, I mean, I'm biased here. I love maps. I like creating maps and goofing off in them. So this is an effective tool to really show and demonstrate what the divide looks like in a given locality. So I am just going to share the live version of this map. So a little bit more background. It cannot be emphasized enough that this tool is free. It's free to sign up. It's free to register. Using Sioux Falls, South Dakota as our geography here, we're able to see by census tract, in this case, the rate of broadband subscription in Sioux Falls. To the left, we have a nice little chart here. It's fully interactive. As I hover my mouse over different census tracts on this map, I'm able to see more detail. What I love about using a tool like this that is fully interactive is that I can lay over additional demographics that are taken from the American Community Survey data set. So for instance, if you're looking at these two red areas in the middle, you may be wondering, okay, those might be industrial areas, Paolo. Maybe no one lives there. Maybe that's an airport where it wouldn't make sense for there to be a broadband subscription. Well, I can prove that people live there by pulling up population density. So when I click on these areas and I get a nice little zoom in, this area, which is downtown Sioux Falls, South Dakota, I get nice little data points broken up into the census tract that are showing me the rate of broadband subscription. In this case, it's quite low for the area, 58.8%, as well as a population density figure, 3,777 persons per square mile. In other words, just a quick data analysis, people live here, they don't have a fair amount of them don't have a broadband subscription. Now, other ways to illustrate this digital divide, and again, as you can see here, I'm just selecting different categories here. Families in poverty, another measurement of community health. Forgive me as I battle this map for a second. All right, I'll use another census tract as an example. So adjacent to 2.01, which I was just looking at, I see again the rate of broadband subscription, which for this particular census tract remains quite low, as well as a percentage of families in poverty. Now, what does this all mean? If you're not a map person, then you may be saying, oh boy, I can't wait until this part of the webinar is done. But what you can do with this sort of information is you can visually demonstrate the digital divide in your area, right? If you're a community member, or if you're interested in digital inclusion and you're plugging in from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, you recognize these areas, right? You live here. These are your neighbors. You know where the rates of where the lower income areas are in your community. And using a tool like this that is fully interactive is not only a useful metric for you to further understand the digital divide in your community, it's useful for you to share out with people who may be dipping their toes into this world for the first time. So let me go back to my other slideshow here. Okay. Right, so another way of saying this is that the data overlaps. There is a relationship. There are correlations between, in that case, the category for broadband access, as well as rates of poverty, as well as population density, median household income. It's just a useful way for us to understand digital inclusion as this holistic field that we're all working in. One of the things that NDIA did a few years ago, given similar tools, is we published a report about digital redlining in Cleveland, which we used Cleveland as our geography, and we showed the fact that these disparities by community health existed in Cleveland. Our definition of digital redlining from that report goes, we describe it as income-based discrimination against residents of lower income urban neighborhoods in the types of broadband service and ISP offers, and also in an ISP's investment in improved service. So another way of saying that is that we, using a carrier as an example, showed their lack of access or their lack of service to areas in Cleveland that fell upon the same lines of income level, poverty, race, you name it. Now, if you are a data person, if you like tables and ACS tables as much as I do, we have a website. We have a web page for you. The data research page on the NDIA website provides our guidance for which tables to use on the ACS 5-year as well. Right,
and a big thank you to Bob Balance, who put together that i3 tool out of the goodness of his heart, which is really a tool that all of us very much appreciate. So big thanks to Bob. We're going to move on now to connectivity. So as Paolo was explaining, the digital inclusion startup manual that we created has all the legs of the stool plus some other chapters in it. We're going to keep referencing that startup manual because if you are in the 101 camp for digital inclusion, that startup manual is really valuable to you. The affordable internet access. The first thing I think folks think about is Lifeline. Lifeline is a federal subsidy for phone, and one of the first things NDIA did was help get that definition expanded to include broadband. But the reality today is that it's still only $9.25. Folks still need a phone. And so the majority of Lifeline subscribers are phone subscribers, and there are actually not very many wireline broadband plans out there. If you go to USAC's website, Sabrina, if you would throw that in the chat, that would be super. You can look up what the Lifeline offers are in your area, and what you're mostly going to find is mobile offers. With a mobile offer, what you get is 3 gig of data. Please nobody say that that's broadband. Right? So it's not a useful tool now for helping folks subscribe to home internet service. What is useful are two other things that Miles is going to tell you about. Miles.
Thank you, Angela. So what are the resources available to help people get low-cost broadband internet? As Angela mentioned, there is Lifeline, but Lifeline is still limited. It is out of reach for a lot of people. So one resource that can be used is NDIA's free and low-cost internet plans page, which lists offers from ISPs about free and low-cost service being provided in an area. And the great thing about this list is that it does address the three fundamental questions when looking for broadband of what, where, and how. What offers are being made available by internet service providers? Where are these offers being made available? And how can I sign up for them? Now, it's extremely important to know those three things when I'm looking for resources to fill the gap of broadband that I might not necessarily be able to fill anywhere else. And pictured on the screen in front of you is a screenshot of what that list looks like. That is on NDIA's site. And it tells us the provider that is providing the service, where it's available, how to apply, as well as a lot of additional information about the service that is being provided. All those red words are hyperlinks that will take you to the relevant website. So I really think it is a fantastic source, and I highly encourage you to go and make use of it. Another resource is seen in the advent of single payer agreements. Now, a single payer agreement is a local effort in providing affordable internet through bulk purchase of service from an internet service provider. But even this is still at the moment somewhat limited. At present, only Cox and Comcast are providing what could be considered low-cost options. And that is options based on their current low-cost plans. And so it really is a patchwork of responses in addressing the need for broadband internet service. Now, in addition to knowing, to us knowing about these services, it's extremely important for us to be able to communicate this information to our communities, to people who need to make use of them. And so knowing about the existence of these services is one thing, but we also need to make sure that people who need them are aware of them. But also that information is coming from trusted sources, from community members, from organizations in communities that people trust and that people are familiar with. So moving on to affordable devices. Hey,
Miles, can I add one more point about the
please, yes,
the broadband access? The list that we have is for organizations such as you all on the call. If you want to send the individuals themselves to a tool to help them to see what they are eligible for, that's everyoneon.org. And Sabrina will throw that link in for us. So we have one tool for you as practitioners, but then there's a separate tool. And the reason we created this tool separate from Everyone On is because as a practitioner who wants to help multiple people, you want to see what your options are and how they compare. Back to you, Miles.
Thank you. And Sabrina, I believe, has dropped the link for that in the chat. Thank you, Sabrina. So with regards to affordable devices, I mean, it's one thing to have affordable internet, but at the same time, we need to be able to make use of that through a device. And the affordability of devices presents another barrier, another challenge to people being able to get online. So two of the most prominent options in getting low-cost devices to those who need them are bulk purchase, which, similar to the single payer agreement, it's the same idea except with devices, where if I purchase devices in bulk, I'm able to pass on those savings to people who purchase the devices themselves for their personal use. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that it solves that problem. it's still, it might still be expensive to buy new devices in bulk. And at the moment, as a result of our current situation with COVID-19, there is a bit of a bottleneck with regards to getting devices. And so getting devices to people who need them is difficult. So in this case, and during these times, we can turn to PC refurbishing. And very quickly, what PC refurbishing is the donation of hardware from private donors or corporate entities, and the repurposing of those devices for reuse, for a second life. So looking to examples of resources, one prominent example is that of the Cleveland Foundation, where the Cleveland Foundation capitalized on refurbishing practices to bring organizations like PCs for People who refurbish these devices to Cleveland. But interestingly, this organization, PCs for People, was brought into Cleveland pre-COVID. And as a result of this, there's almost a sense of resiliency to some extent with regards to the need for hardware, with regards to the need for devices. The strategy to deal with the shortage of access to devices was already in place because of this initiative between Cleveland Foundation and PCs for People. Now, another example is the National Christina Foundation. This is a group that facilitates the hardware donation process by allowing donors to find locations that need devices, but also by providing a guide, a step-by-step guide on how donations may be made. That means that if I'm an organization that wants to make a donation, but I don't know how to do it, I can go onto the National Christina Foundation website and have a guide, a walkthrough of how that process can be achieved. And then finally, belonging to the Christina Foundation is the Alliance for Technology, Refurbishing and Reuse, or AFTER. And AFTER's legislative work and aim to create a national model and methodology for refurbishment allows for the disposal of hardware in a way that allows for reuse, allows for refurbishment. And for additional information on this, I would definitely encourage you and point you towards Chapter 6 of the NDIA Startup Manual that lists these resources and these methodologies, as well as taking you to the specific sites that you might find more information at. Now, next, Paolo is going to talk about digital literacy training. So back to you, Paolo.
Thanks, Miles. Right, so in response to COVID-19, there were two chapters in our startup manual that got the most overhaul. One of them was digital literacy training. The abiding question when I was convening working groups and asking our field of experts, how are you adapting your training to a remote learning framework, focused around four main questions. I was asking them the same four questions over and over. Where are you conducting your computer classes? Who are you teaching? What types of new classes are coming up, if any? As well as how are you doing this, right? So we came across two different methods or two different categories of remote learning in an age of COVID-19. We're talking either asynchronous instruction or live instruction. Asynchronous instruction refers to the idea, that an organization, if they have the capacity, can create internal resource guides for classes, for computer-related classes. For instance, signing up or logging into a Zoom call. If an organization had capacity to do that in-house, then they would just create a guide, put it on their website and say, okay, hey learners, click here. You don't have to tune into a class at a given time. Sometime I learned that several organizations, this COVID-19 was an opportunity for them to get their YouTube channel, to revisit their YouTube channels, creating new content for YouTube, creating 3 to 5 minute videos for learners at home, just to send and sending out a link to anyone interested in continuing digital skilling. Another component of organizations adapting to COVID-19 was this idea of live instruction. I came from again, as I said, I came from the New York Public Library in the technology training program department. Back in mid-March, back in April, me and my department were trying to figure out how do we keep our heads above water? How do we keep delivering our classes to our learners, right? As instructors, we loved teaching our students. We knew several of our students by first name. We would say hi to them on the subway. So these questions of where, who, what, and how are questions that I had some idea of in my head because I went through it with the library, but I was also asking our working groups how they adapted their programs. So the big question was where. In a social distancing age, in a remote learning age, we can't be bringing in our students indoors. At least that's how it was back in March and April, right? We're seeing now that some organizations are able to have limited capacity computer classes, but still the question on people's minds is how are we reaching learners at home? That's still the framework that we're working in. So this conversation really focused around which video delivery platform is appropriate for your organization and for your learners. In my case, at the NYPL, we knew enough about our students because we had been teaching them for several years. We knew what level of skill they were at, right? If they're coming into a computer, like a basics computer class, we need to make sure that they can access an online platform like this. We also needed to make sure that we were being as inclusive as possible. For instance, we couldn't assume that everyone had a Gmail account. So unfortunately, Google Meet was out. Given what we knew about our learners, we decided that Zoom maybe was a little bit too high of an ask for our learners. Might be too much to ask our learners to download this software and then to create an account and then to log into a Zoom call. I say this without any sarcasm at all. I'm sure that most people on this webinar have had some troubles with Zoom, and we're all professionals, right? So even if we had troubles with Zoom, what could we expect of our learners? We wanted to lower the bar. We wanted to make the bar as low as possible to include as many different types of learners as possible. So the video platform that we decided to use is in the startup manual. It's fully browser-based. It's just a link that we send out to our learners and say, hey, just click this at 1 p.m. on Thursday when the class is scheduled to start. The class will begin. Really taking into account what our learners' needs were and who they and what they were interested in is framed a lot of our organization's response to COVID. So that answered the question of who is our audience. Well, we had a previous relationship. Sometimes we had long subway rides with them. We knew our learners quite well. Another big change in response to COVID was what types of classes should we be teaching? Are there new types of classes? Are there new classes that are newly interesting to learners in a COVID-19 framework, in a distance learning framework? So what we did and what I've learned several organizations across the country have did is create new classes relating to topics such as online grocery delivery. An organization called Tech Goes Home in Boston created a short YouTube video that walks folks through using different online grocery delivery services such as Peapod, Instacart, Fresh Direct. It still takes the shape of a traditional computer learning class in which the instructor is simply narrating how to use that website, as well as talking about the pros and cons. So taking into account topics that are newly interesting. This is where topics such as telehealth and online banking are gaining renewed interest as well, especially in response to COVID. Finally, this last question that I was asking our working groups, how are you doing these digital literacy trainings? This was really a question of capacity. So does your organization have the capacity to have part-time, full-time staff dedicated to delivering these classes? Great. If not, consider volunteers, right? Job force development work centers in communities are access points for reaching folks who are interested in volunteering. Programs like AmeriCorps, always available. and who are frequently used in programs to deliver these new training materials. Of course, these programs have a set of tests and barriers for their volunteers, because they want to make sure that their product that they're delivering is quite good. So in the manual, we have, again, we have all of that in the manual. I cannot stress enough how great it is, because I worked on it, but also it's newly updated and finished with these components taken into mind. Couldn't be stressed enough, everything that we do and everything that these organizations did was based on learner feedback. There was always a back and forth, even in a pilot phase, there was always a back and forth between the organization and their learner. The organization asking their learners, for instance, did you like this? Do you like this platform? What didn't you like about this platform? What do you like about this platform? Other questions relating to availability of your students. For instance, is there a certain time of day that you prefer to take classes? What we learned at the NYPL is that some folks preferred this first option, the asynchronous category. They preferred to just be able to click on a link at their convenience and not have to be kind of beholden to a certain time of day. One of the big things, aside from the actual digital literacy instruction, that changed in response to COVID-19 was this idea of tech support. The phone has, there's new life being breathed into the phone as folks are trying to connect through distance. So as organizations have adapted to teaching during COVID-19, staff roles have evolved to address their learner needs over the phone. So it can be useful to have a knowledgeable, especially patient staff to assist at the intake stage of reference. That helps build a rapport between your student and your organization, especially as both of you try to adapt to distance learning. This intake stage, we in library world refer to as the reference interview. That refers to the moment in which a library patron walks through the library doors, approaches the librarian at their desk and asks a question like, I need help signing up for Facebook. If you have been on the other side of this interaction, if you're a librarian tuning in, then you may know that sometimes your learner, sometimes a library patron, they're asking for help and they may not have the language or the vocabulary to describe what their needs are, right? So there is a conversation, there is an interview in which the librarian is trying to figure out, okay, what do you actually need right now, and how can I direct you in the right direction? Or how can I point you in the right direction? NDIA took that sort of model, given a lot of feedback from our affiliates across the country, and surprise, surprise, put together a working group under this flag that we call digital navigators. Digital navigators essentially replicate this reference interview as a replicable model to be shared with organizations across the country. We're still convening this working group. I'm always still listening in and learning from essentially the best in the field, asking them, how are you addressing this gap in the intake process, right? What is that conversation like when someone calls your organization and says that they need help accessing the internet? This is an ongoing program here at NDIA. And here's a list of some free assessment and training materials. The fuller list can be found in the startup manual. Again, cannot emphasize enough that these are free training materials. We've broken these materials up into different categories. So some of these materials, but not all, have all three of these categories. So by instructor materials, you can see that's something like Digital Learn from the Public Library Association has on its website some materials for an instructor to read through. This can involve items such as like an outline for the class, as well as some background research information. Some of these organizations have a set curriculum, a full curriculum for you to take, use, iterate, and make better for your learners. Most of these organizations have self-guided resources. So by self-guided resources, I'm referring again to that idea of asynchronous instruction. So these self-guided resources can take the form of guides, of short YouTube videos, walking you and your team of instructors how to use the particular training materials available on their website. Right, so it wouldn't be a complete digital inclusion program without funding and partnerships. This is the chapter 8 of our startup manual. So this again, along with chapter 4, got a lot of overhaul, got a lot of revision. Once again, the revision on the startup manual was born out of working groups. So just some takeaways from having conversations with folks across the country who are getting their programs off the ground. There are 2 main takeaways. We're learning that the organizations that are best preparing for long-term sustainability, put a big underline under that word sustainability. A, they're responding to COVID in their communities aggressively and effectively. They got off the ground fast. B, they were engaging and building relationships with newly concerned community and business leaders. That may be all of us in this webinar right now, newly engaged, people who are new to this space. So what I would recommend is reading through the startup manual, figuring out the language that you want to use, figuring out a tool like i3 to be able to demonstrate a need in your community are effective ways for you to do some of this pre-work when you reach out to community and business leaders. Some community and business leaders who are historically active in the digital inclusion space, this may not be surprising, also require their customers or their clients to use the internet. So we're talking about banks, we're talking about healthcare providers. Both of these sort of institutions have a robust online presence. It's useful for them, it's useful for their customers, their clients, their patients to be able to know how to access their materials online. So banks, through the Community Reinvestment Act, which is through the Federal Reserve, are historic partners in the digital inclusion space. Healthcare providers, of course, are big workers in the digital inclusion space. Of course, lastly, the local, state, and federal governments are newly interested in this space. The CARES Act in particular has ignited funding in the digital inclusion world, and it's also ignited some interests in this world. Maybe that's what brought you to this webinar. This is one more plug for our listserv, but our listserv is an active space in which people are having this conversation, right? Like, how is your organization using CARES money? So I think that's a good way for us to transition into how you can stay involved.
And back to Miles.
Back to Miles.
Thank you. So I guess I want to say join our community. We are an extremely active listserv, and there are a number of ways you can join the NDIA community with several different options. First, you can be a friend. We love friends. In becoming a friend, you have access to our newsletter. You get signed up to our listserv, which is, as I mentioned, extremely active. We have some brilliant people on that email list, and it helps people keep up to date with the very latest developments in the digital inclusion community. Furthermore, you get access to our Friday community calls. As Angela mentioned earlier, these used to be the COVID calls, but now they are the community calls, and there is always a very interesting, very engaging conversation that happens. This is a free option. I cannot stress this enough. This is a fantastic resource that is absolutely free. The second option that is available is to become an NDIA affiliate. And affiliates are for nonprofit organizations that want to join the NDIA community. This is, again, a very, very free option. You get, as with becoming a friend of NDIA, access to our newsletter, access to our community calls, our weekly community calls, and our listserv. But you also get listed on the NDIA website and provided with an NDIA affiliate badge. So very cool stuff. The third option is our paid for option, and this allows you to become an NDIA subscriber. And what a subscriber is with the same access that affiliates and friends have, but who pay an annual fee to have a personalized relationship with NDIA. And those benefits include, as I said, the newsletter, the community calls, the listserv, but also discounts to NDIA events, invitations to our monthly subscriber calls, and invitations to our working groups. And before you say, no, I'm not going to pay for anything, I can't afford it, subscriber costs are based on the budget of the organization that is applying. So it's not a one size fits all. This is a flexible cost. And you can join this community at digitalinclusion.org/join. I am the one responsible for keeping up to date on all our new community members. I'm going to put my email in the chat along with the link to join our community. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. Thank you.
That's perfect. Thank you, Miles. Thank you, Paolo. Okay, friends, that's our full presentation. We appreciate your patience with all of our links in the chat. I find it on the amusing side. This is a pretty good problem. We have so many links to give you. I wasn't sure if we had posted them or not because it's kind of overrun with links. So that's pretty awesome. I'm being reminded by a link in the chat from Sabrina that Digital Inclusion Week is October 5th through the 9th. And that is a super easy way for you to make new friends in the digital inclusion field and to promote the issue of digital equity. So follow the link. It shows you how to participate. Pre-COVID day, we have lots of in-person events. Our affiliates would hold celebrations and they would hold summits. So some of that is still happening online. Some folks have come up with some really creative ways to do it 6 feet apart. So you can add your event there. I encourage you to do that, even if it is a not complicated event, because the media does check that list. And so who knows what comes of being on the list. And I suspect this year, Digital Inclusion Week is going to be even more popular than it has been in the past. So any other questions from folks? We answered a lot in the chat. We answered some in the Q&A. So a lot of those are there. As it was clear through all of the links that we're throwing in the chat, there's a lot of resources on our website. So please make use of the website. Talk to Miles about joining or fill out the form on the website. And I think we're going to let everybody go. Thank you. We appreciate you all joining us.